Welcome to the Safety Committee University and another great training module presented by Chris Lawrence. With over 20 years in occupational safety and health, Chris Lawrence is a retired U.S. Air Force safety professional who is the Western Region Safety Manager for Boise Cascade. At Boise, their new hire orientation starts with a discussion on personal risk management and continues with a series of leadership discussions on what safety is at Boise Cascade, Western Oregon region. This includes integrity, reporting, soundness of mind, behavior expectations, and general safe practices. Chris has served on the ASSP Southern Oregon Chapter Executive Committee in various positions, including several times as president, as well as on regional and national committees with the American Society of Safety Professionals. Chris will be presenting today on hazard identification, another one of the required trainings for safety committees in Oregon, and an important part of any successful safety program. Please help me welcome Chris Lawrence.
Welcome to the Southern Oregon chapter of the American Society of Safety Professionals, Safety Committee University. I'm Chris Lawrence and I'll be your presenter for hazard identification portion of Safety Committee University. Do I really need hazard ID? Well, if you're a member of a safety committee in the state of Oregon that's covered by the Oregon OHSA jurisdiction, then yes you do. And so let's carry on and see why else you might need it. Like I said, do we really need to have it? The answer is it's required by Oregon OHSA, and we'll get into what that standard is shortly. But it's important to note that it's of value. It's a good move for Oregon OHSA to require this because it allows us as an organization to look at ourselves, to help identify our own hazards and fix them in place. And by requiring it, it helps us to move towards training and the things that would do to make us better at finding our own and controlling our own hazards. It makes our safety committee better. A good example would be is if I am a safety committee member and I train myself in hazard ID and I develop my ability to find the hazards in our company, then I will find myself functioning better as a member of the committee. And when I do that, the committee is better, it's more functional, it's more viable, and I'm going to have more fun or enjoying my time being a part of that organization. And simply, it's the right thing to do. We need to take care of our teammates. We want to make sure everybody goes home safe every day. And so whether it's an OHSA standard that's required or whether it makes my safety committee better, the fact is sending people home is our mission as a safety committee, sending them home safely. What is our objective today? We're going to cover a basic introduction for hazard identification. In other words, this presentation will not be everything you need to know for hazard ID. It's an introduction that will help you to find ways to learn more about what you need to do to be the best that you can be for hazard identification. We'll discuss an approach to discover hazards in the workplace, a systematic approach, and we'll create a mindset for conducting hazards and audits rather than identifying specific hazards. And what I mean there is, if we can create a focus, a way of setting our mind ready to go and identify specific types of hazards, a way of doing that, then we're going to be far better off when we go back to our operations and we put this into play. If all I presented, and by the way, there is no way we could present all the hazards that we could identify in the state of Oregon with the multitude of organizations that's here. We could sit and go through thousands of slides and try to find hazards in there, and you might learn from that. But the reality of it is you really need to focus on your own organization and build your skills and develop for them. From there, we really kind of need to maybe set the stage for what we're focusing on. And the focus is going to be in three areas: the basic OHSA requirements, a look at the format, as I've talked about, for systematic, an organized way of doing hazard identification inspections and building your skills while you do that. And then if we're going to talk about that, we do kind of have to focus on the various types of hazards, and we'll have a section specifically on that. We're going to define a hazard. A hazard is the potential for harm. So in other words, if we know what we're going to, if we have to do hazard identification, we really have to know what a hazard is. It's something that has a potential for harm. In practical means, or in practical terms, a hazard often is associated with condition or activity that, if uncontrolled, can result in an injury or illness. Eliminating or controlling them as early as possible is prevention. And the reality of this, of hazard ID, is that by honing our eyes, by building our skills, by focusing on what we need to do in our workplaces, we can identify those hazards, we can control them, which shortly stated, or best stated, is that we create an area or a situation where we've prevented hazards and everybody goes home safe at the end of the day. That is a noble goal, and this is why hazard identification is very important, but you've got to understand what the hazards are first. Let's see what Oregon OHSA has to say about hazard identification and safety committees. First of all, if you go to the website, you'll be able to, Oregon OHSA website, it's easy, you can just search for it, you'll find it. Go to Division 1. If you look up Oregon Administrative Rule 437-001-0765, it's titled Safety Committees. You'll find pretty much everything you need to know about the rules for safety committees. The interesting thing is if you go to the website, it's very simple. You'll find an A to Z topic list. If you click on the S, it'll take you to the S section, and you'll find Safety Committee, and you simply just click on Safety Committee, and you'll find a variety of rules. Mainly, they will begin to discuss Safety Committee activities that must be completed. You have to have procedures for conducting workplace safety and health inspections. In other words, you must establish a way of doing it. But if you're going to do inspections, then it makes sense, there's a purpose behind those inspections, and that is to identify hazards that could hurt our people. So we have to train members in hazard identification. So in other words, we must do hazard identification inspections, and people have to be trained to be able to do that. You have to be able to conduct inspections according to these frequencies. As an example, they set it up by columns. If you are in a primary fixed location, an office environment, an auxiliary or satellite organization, or a mobile situation, there's a frequency for doing your inspections. These three are going to be, or the primary fixed location, office, and auxiliary is going to be a quarterly safety inspection, hazard identification inspection. Then the mobile one is you have to look at what's the frequency that the mobile or situation will be in place, what are the types of hazards, how often would you expect to see these hazards creep up. As an example, starting of a construction project, you might have road hazards that you're concerned with at first, but later in the project you might be more concerned with machinery hazards. So you have to set up a schedule that the safety committee has agreed to identify those hazards. So now that we know the rules, what's next? It's finding hazards. We can all find obvious hazards, and we're going to spend some time talking about obvious hazards. For me, it's hugely important to focus or foot stomp obvious hazards. The reason for that is we can simply go and find the obvious hazards, but I have found that yes, those do hurt people, but there's a lot of hazards that might be missed that wind up hurting our people just as bad, and we need to be able to find those. So a good example is, we all get this, you see this photo. What's the hazard? The hazard is the cord across the floor. All of us can get that, we all see it. Tripping hazards on the floor are obvious. But are there hazards that are not so obvious that we need to pay attention to? And we'll kind of go through each of these, and I'll put a story to it to help bring it all together. Sometimes we don't recognize the condition as a hazard. It's because we just didn't have the knowledge before to understand that this is actually a hazard, either one, because it truly is a hazard that could hurt our people right here, right now, or because it's a rule that we have to perform a certain way and eventually could hurt our personnel. Maybe we understand what the hazards are, but we just get used to them being around. And this is kind of like being complacent. We'll talk to that as well. And maybe we just don't know, and so we make an assumption that everything is safe. We want to move through a learning process so that we can get better identifying things. And as we grow with that, we'll be able to find things that we hadn't seen in the past. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's say that I'm new to the safety committee and I work in the machine shop. And today the safety committee is doing its quarterly inspection. And I've been assigned to go walk through the tire shop. And when I go into the tire shop, I see cords and hoses, primarily hoses, on the floor. And I'm going to identify those as hazards because truly they are hazards. But in reality, they're an essential part of the tire technician's work. Those hoses are needed to do the job. So while I'm focused on that simple and obvious hazard, which really may not be something that they can deal with and they can't change inside the tire shop, I might be missing a more prevalent hazard that I didn't recognize at all just because my knowledge was not there. And it's not because I haven't learned enough in life and I haven't done the right things. It's because my perspective comes from the machine shop and not the tire shop. What I know about hazards in the machine shop, I might be able to identify and control more readily. But because the tire shop is new to me, it's not something that I'm used to inspecting, I may not find all the hazards. Vice versa with the tire shop personnel coming into the machine shop. So here's a good example of what I mean. Let's say that today I'm going to be inspecting a manufacturing setting. And I go out and I look around and it all looks good to me. I see the facility. I don't see any hazards. It all seems good. However, a skilled safety committee member goes in there and they say, well, this is a manufacturing setting. And we manufacture these widgets which are made from fiberboard. So because of that, we probably might have something in the air. So we should look for that, see if we have anything in the air today that's a problem for us. Plus, we'll look at the facility. So we go in, we look at the facility, and we don't see anything in the air, and the facility looks good. However, the seasoned safety committee member doing this inspection, trying to identify hazards, has learned something. They've learned that if they shine a bright light or can get the right kind of light in place, they might actually see particles in the air that otherwise you can't see. A good example would be a bright flashlight or a camera itself with a flash on it. You take a picture just into the air and you might see the particles floating there. So here's an example. You might see this beam of light and you can see all these particles. They are also over here, but you can't see them. So there's a hazard that could potentially be there that I was unaware of and maybe didn't have the skills or mindset to be able to do this type of hazard identification where the skilled person did. So this is why it's so important to understand that finding hazards is born out of obviously being there and doing it, but also learning and growing and honing your eyes for hazard identification. That's the point. Let's go to learn. Let's spend more time learning. There's a variety of ways to learn, ways to improve your eyes for hazard. You can attend audits with other people. You can go to different organizations, different departments, get some mentoring with other companies, things that may be available to you if you just ask. Learn from the standards. There's OHSA standards. There's a variety of standards that you can read that are related to the hazard committee or the safety committee and a variety of safety standards for a variety of types of jobs. You can learn from OHSA publications such as fact sheets. These would be a fact sheet that's a very quick and very powerful way to learn about specific subjects. As an example here, we have crystalline silica, We have the safety committee and meetings and walking and working surfaces. These are immediate sources that you can pull off the Oregon OSHA website to use to help build your education and knowledge of what you should be looking for in terms of hazards. Also, there's job safety analysis that your company may have. You may have standard operating procedures. You may have policies. You may have basic general rules. All of these that if you read and study, you'll be able to put into play as you do your hazard identification. There's additional learning opportunities that are available to you, such as trade organizations. Just as an example, the American Society of Safety Professionals is a trade organization for the safety profession. There's the American General Contractors Association, AGC, who can help with construction safety activities. There's a variety of trade organizations that would be out there that will have safe materials for safe training. Workers' compensation, loss consultants. If your company has a loss firm, such as Safe Corporation or a variety of other companies, they have loss control consultants that can come to your organization and help you do audits, and you can learn from them. You can contact Oregon OSHA Consultation Service. It's one of the best in the country, and OSHA loves to help. It's free and it's confidential, so why not use it? You can learn from it. Past regulatory inspections and citations, if you're aware of any of those, you can review to find out why did you get the citation, why did the company get the citation, and what were the ways of fixing the condition that resulted in the citation. You can look at prior incidents, review accident investigations, incident investigations that your company may have, that your safety committee has put together, and be able to find why did those situations occur and is there potential for them in the future. And then you can develop trend analysis data. The trend analysis data is a really good process for being able to identify what's been going on so that you can predict what could happen in the future, but you can also look at where things are really occurring right at the moment that really need your focus. So again, there's a variety of tools that you can help to learn to help you identify hazards in your workplace. Overall, you should learn, identify ways to apply what you learn, gain a passion for it, and let me talk to that a little bit. So if I'm learning, if I'm spending some time to learn, and I'm identifying ways to apply that, so I learn the subject, and now I want to go put it into play. If I don't gain a passion for it, I'm not going to learn as much as I want, and I'm not going to be able to put it in play as effective as I'd like. So it's very important that these things be held in your mind as you're going through hazard ID growth and performing for your safety committee. Refine your eyes for hazard ID. It's really important to see beyond the obvious. There are hazards that you will begin to notice today as you just start your journey in the safety committee, but then there will if you continue your knowledge and your efforts to build your skill and hone your eyes, you'll find hazards that you were existing when you were first there, but you didn't see them, and now you know. The hazard ID application. In other words, you know that OSHA requires you to have hazard ID as a part of your training as a safety committee member. So we know we got to do that. So now we get the training and we've honed our skills and our eyesight for identifying hazards. Now we have to put it into play. And let's move into that section. There's many ways to conduct a hazard ID. There's the simple visual eyes-on task as a way to start. What I mean by that is if you just tell yourself, I am going to go find hazards today as a member of the safety committee. So I'm going to do a walkthrough. And I'm going to do a walkthrough a little bit differently than I do when I'm walking through the operation on a day-to-day basis. In other words, I may be going from my workstation to the lunchroom, and I just do that every day in a normal, without focus way. And that's the way we carry on throughout our day in a lot of our operations. But if I decided I'm going to walk through the facility today and I'm going to focus on finding hazards, I've now presented myself as a way of doing things a little bit different, of walking through in a different way. And I began to start to identify things because now my focus is more singular towards that objective of finding hazards. You can build success with obvious hazards and sharpen your skills with the not so obvious hazards. And again, let me restate that, it sounds like I'm foot stomping this, and there's a reason for this. The idea is that as I get better at identifying hazards, I control those that are most obviously there, the ones that are most immediate, such as the tripping hazard on the floor. I can take care of that, it's easy to do. But as I've learned, as we've seen, I've maybe never thought about what's in the air in the work environment, but now I can ask a question, what's in the air? And by that question, because of my skills, because I'm better at what I do, I now might be able to get an analysis to see if there is anything in the air that would be a problem. So this is the point of building success with honing your skills. And I say that if I use a system approach, and probably better stated, a systematic approach, I'll be able to understand and build categorically what it is I'm trying to do in hazard ID. So again, let's use a systematic approach. It's a great way to start, and it keeps things simple and focused, such as looking at slips, trips, and falls as a focus, looking at target organ hazards as a focus, the focus for, and we'll get into more detail about that, the facility itself, the environment within the facility, and the personal or the ergonomics part of it. So let's take a look at each one of these individually. Slips, trips, and falls. We're going to talk about slipping, tripping, and falling. Obviously, slipping. Are there things that objects on the floor? Is there water on the floor? Is there concrete with algae that's been built up because of condensation pipes dripping water on it continually? All of these are potential slipping mechanisms. Tripping mechanism, cords across the floor we've already talked about. But as an example, sometimes cords have to be there, sometimes they don't. In a shop, we see these cords and it's an industrial area, so a lot of us might say it's okay. It's still a hazard no matter how we look at it. So should we adjust it? Maybe we can put the cords overhead so they're not on the floor. Over here in this case, it looks like a warehouse area. Tripping hazards may not exist as we see it right there, but the potential is for them to be there. A good example would be the pallets begin to deteriorate and materials will start to fall off, and we've got a potential trip hazard there. There's many things that can cause tripping hazards, whether it's torn carpet, abrupt edges. There's a variety of things, and these are things that you may want to just focus on by looking for tripping hazards. Likewise, falling hazards, things that could cause a fall in the workplace, not necessarily from heights, but from the industrial setting. As an example, an open dock. It may not be 4 feet off the ground, and it may not be required to be protected, but it's still a hazard if somebody were to fall off of it. Stairs that are unguarded, unprotected, that don't have rails, that are in poor condition. This is a great place for somebody to fall, and has happened very often, and it can be quite dangerous. So again, focusing on places and situations where somebody could slip up or fall. Now let's look at target. We'll call these, I call these target hazards, but they're technically target organ hazards. So we're going to look at eyes, ears, nose, throat, and internal organs such as kidney, liver, lungs, these things. Let's start with eyes. Do I have chemicals that I'm transferring within the organization? And are we doing it safely? Are there splashes that are not controlled? Looking at debris that could be flying, or projectiles that could be set out by equipment or machines. Things like this that are flying through the air, or chemical vapors, fumes, splashes, things that could get into somebody's eyes. Do we have equipment, machinery, items that create a very loud noise that could be dangerous to our hearing? Are those things controlled? Either one, controlled by some type of engineering control, or two, by, as a last resort, ear protection. Things that might go into our nose and throat and ultimately affect some kind of a body organ, but the way they get there is through your nose or throat by breathing them, such as dust or hazardous fumes or chemicals that might have vapors that could be hazardous to us. Are we focused on looking for those type of things as we do our hazard IDs? Things that could target the organs themselves through absorption, through inhalation, through ingestion, or through injection. These are things that are in our work environment that we handle, and if we're not handling them correctly, or they're not used, stored, placed correctly, they could be a hazard to the individual. So this is something you would want to identify, and you can do this by focusing on chemicals. All right, let's move on to the Focus 4. Focus 4 is also referred to, or often referred to, as the fatal 4. These are the things that sometimes are, if they happen, are usually quite bad and injurious to people, such as being caught in or struck by electrocutions or falls from heights. Let's talk about being caught in. Machines that are not adequately guarded, whether it be sprockets, chains, shafting, or it could be shears, it could be, there's just a variety of machines. If not adequately guarded, a person could be caught in it and very seriously injured. As another example would be, in this case, a tail drum from a conveyor belt. It doesn't have a guard on it, and this happens to be a self-cleaning tail drum that is highly hazardous. If it gets you, it's going to pull you into it. So this is an example of being caught in. Then there's the struck by. There's the tools that are misplaced and somebody could step on them and whack themselves in the face and chip a tooth, which has happened more than once in many organizations. Or maybe there's a piece of equipment or machinery that's moving around that they could be struck by. So this is a little bit challenging. You would ask yourself, if I'm learning hazard ID and I'm going to go out and ask, do I look for something that's going to be struck by? Well, unless I see something close, a near miss, do I identify it as a struck by? Well, just think about this for a moment. If you can say, if you recognize that moving equipment can be a hazard to personnel, then just ask yourself, do personnel present themselves anywhere near that moving equipment where they could be struck by it? And that's a quick way to help focus on that situation. Electrical. Now, we're not expecting people to be safety committee members who are first learning hazard ID to be electricians or to know very much about electricity at all. But the fact is you should be able to identify hazard or electrical equipment that's in bad repair, or that's missing ground plugs, simple things like this, or maybe the insulation is pulled away. These are some of the most common electrical things. But again, as you're walking by in through the mill or through the plantation or whatever it is, the operation you're in, if you don't have a focused sense of electricity as a hazard, so I'm going to focus on that and try to find these things. These could exist in our work areas, and we've never addressed them. And then falls, the last one of the fatal fours, or the fatal four or the focus four. Falling from heights. Are there holes in roofs, holes in floors? Are there bad ladders that, or anything that a person would use to work at height? Are they in good condition or bad condition? Are we taking chances with transitions and places that we could fall into? These are things that you could focus on if you were looking for fall from height hazards. Then we want to look at the facility. Again, we're not asking you to be engineers. What we're just saying, though, is take a look at some of the structural things. Look at the placement of stuff in your operations. Look at the ergonomics. Ergonomics are technically a part of how the facility is organized. Okay? Look at the conditions, housekeeping, things like that. Paths of travel, dust, and chemicals. Let's focus on these a little bit. If I'm walking up a set of stairs and I see this type of corrosion, or if I see structural building parts that are corroded like that, I'm going to have to question whether or not that's safe. Now, it may be safe. I'll let an engineer decide that. But to me, it looks like a hazard, so I'm going to identify it. I can see this dust buildup The dust itself may not be a hazard, but if something happens to that dust, you could have a catastrophic explosion that could totally damage the facility and or hurt people in a tremendous way. So looking at the facility's structure is important. Once we identify it, then we can get a structural engineer. Another point to this part is if you have this kind of dust buildup or you have this kind of corrosion buildup, it means that there's protective systems or operational systems that may not be working as they should. So therefore, maybe it's not just cleaning up the dust, it's finding out why it's getting there. And that hazard ID leads you to a much bigger concern and something that really needs to be fixed. The paths of travel, getting out in an emergency, such as blocked exits or blocked fire extinguishers, systems that are used to, in an emergency, if you have exit routes, stairways, fire extinguishers, fire hoses, these type of things, they all need to be readily available and clear for use. And why we see things like this is because while we may have had safety committee members doing these types of inspections and doing these audits, they've missed these things because their eyes were not tuned or focused to it. Excuse me. They were more focused on whether the machine was guarded or not. What does the exit look like? So again, as far as the facility goes, paths of travel is a good focus. Then what kind of chemicals are in the area? Are they labeled correctly? Are they stored correctly? Are they housed, or the integrity of the containers in good shape? Are they used for the right purpose inside the facility? Let me give you a good example. I once saw a situation where caustic soda was used to clean a very specific part of the facility. It worked so well that people got the idea, well, let's use it somewhere else. Now all of a sudden, that chemical is creating a hazard that nobody ever inspected, and the next thing you see is an employee is on his way to the hospital because he's got caustic soda in his eyes. So again, stored, used, housed, maintained correctly. Chemicals. All right. Let's move on to environmental. Is the place hot? Such as, are there things in the area that could burn somebody? Are there hoses, heaters, a variety of things that can cause fire, but more importantly, overheat somebody, burn somebody? Are there systems there that just the environment, it's just so hot outside that it might be 100 degrees outside, but because of their work environment, it might be 130 degrees there. And what kind of hazards is that causing for them? Those are things you may want to address. But it could also be too cold. Is there ice on the ground? Is there ice on the forks of the forklift? Is the truck bed, does it covered in ice? Is there somebody who's outside who's exposed? Maybe they don't have the right kind of clothes to do the job. Maybe they're getting damp because of the work that they're doing, and now their hands or feet are freezing. Are they doing something in the work environment that promotes fatigue? This is an example. Environment. We talked about noise hazards in the sense of hurting our ears, but they can also be very fatiguing. Long hours, extra effort, cold, heat, vibration, all of these things can add to the fatigue of an individual. And when you lose fatigue, you lose focus on the job, and you're just trying to get it done. And unfortunately, we see that often leads to hazardous situations. Is there enough light, or is there too much light? As an example, if you're doing delicate work, having to strain to see what you're doing because you don't have enough light causes you to have a headache, causes you to have fatigue, there's a variety of things that it does, which also then creates probably unsafe behaviors in a lot of cases. Is it too dark? Do you not have enough light? These are some of the environmental things that you can focus on. Personal, such as ergonomics, soft tissue, and I'm going to throw in this term personal risk and management, which we'll spend a little bit of time on it. So ergonomics is basically the idea behind ergonomics is building the workplace, the work center, the job to the human element, because people might be 5'1" or they might be 6'2", and they're still supposed to work at the same workstation. Ergonomically, it may not work for the shorter person, or it may not work for the taller person. Can we have something that fixes or works for all different heights? That's the idea generally from ergonomics. But to give you kind of a quick example, could be if people are leaning against something all the time to do their work, and you see this in a hazard ID evaluation. Somebody is hitting something with their hand. They constantly have to hit something with their hand to make the product move or work. There's a variety of things where you just have to watch the body of the individuals and see where they're contacting, moving, bending, twisting. That creates an ergonomic hazard. Ultimately, these things affect soft tissue. And one way you can focus on ergonomics and soft tissue is to, as you do your hazard ID, is you can talk to people. You can ask them, at the end of the day, where do you hurt? And what do you suppose gets you to hurt that way? That's an advanced level of hazard identification that you should get to, but you only get there is if you focus on it. Personal risk management. Personal risk management is watching people, and sometimes we just know that people are doing the best they can. They're just trying to get the job done. But their perception says, do it at all costs, do it this way, do it however I'm going to do it, I'm just going to get it done. Maybe they don't know the right procedure, maybe they don't do the safe procedure. The fact is all they know is they need to get it done. So personal risk management, if you're looking at this from a personal risk management, is you're watching a person to see how they do the work and to see if they're concerned about their health and their safety and the way they engage the work. And then you can talk to them about that. It's a pretty involved subject, and that's another subject line of its own, but it's worth looking at to see how people actually engage the work. Good examples would be, how do they lift? How do they move their body? Do they overextend? As a good example would be, we know that people shouldn't be lifting more than 50 pounds, and if they do, it should be right here. It shouldn't be out here. If we see this is a hazard. So as a hazard ID, yes, it's personal. It's not a machine going to grab somebody. We probably ought to identify that as a hazard and predominantly a hazardous procedure. And again, the body, you can watch people and how they move. As an example, if they pick up a bucket like this and move it over here, they're not moving correctly. They're ergonomically going to tear their body up and have some type of soft tissue situation. And then a good example over here in this photo is the person who's reaching too high. Could they use a step stool? Could they rearrange what's being stored so that they can get at it easier? These are things that, again, are applicable to many work locations and would eliminate ergonomic issues. So now, once you've identified all these things that you can focus on, whether it be slips, trips, and falls, whether it be focus 4, whether it be caught in, struck by electrical, falling, whether it's the chemicals or the facility or the environment, once you again begin focusing on these things, you will begin to identify them. And once you identify them, you got to do something with them. And that's where we're going to move to this other part of what hazard ID and the reason why we need to have hazard ID training. All right, once you've identified those hazards, you now have to put some action into place. So regarding identified hazards, as a safety committee, you want to discuss the safety and health issues that you've identified. You want to look at the tools that were involved, the equipment that's involved, the work environment, the work practices, the hazards of the work practices, and you want to be able to document those. But it's important to understand what that conversation is. You want to be able to identify the hazards that you need to be able to talk about the hazards you've identified, but you want to understand what policies did they violate, what rules did they violate, how did we get there, why do those exist? What are some of the considerations we might do to control or fix those? Or how can we eliminate them altogether? These are discussions that the safety committee should have about the hazards that they've identified. And again, clearly documenting. And when I talk about documenting, I think it's important to identify the hazard specifically as you see it, clearly identify it so that everybody reading it will know exactly what it is you're talking about. Then provide the date and the time and the person who may be bird dogging it, or the person who found it. And then also you want to include a recommendation. And if you can, maybe even put in there why you believe that hazard is existing. Okay? So that's going to be in your documentation. Once you have this, you need to forward it on to your leadership or your management team. You're going to provide recommended corrective actions and a reasonable date for management to respond. So you want to be able to provide the recommended corrective actions. It is possible that management may look at this and decide, well, this is not really a hazard, so we're not going to be able to fix that. But these things are a hazard, so we're going to take care of those. We need to get back to the safety committee as to what we're going to do. It's interesting, again, that if I just simply create the document and forward it to leadership, leadership may not feel they have an obligation to get back to me. It may get lost in time, lost in space, whatever it is. But if I provide them with those corrective actions, recommended corrective actions, and I say, now get back to us as a safety committee by this date, then we'll find that leadership or management is more likely to engage it and get back to us in a timely way. One really important aspect is making sure that you assign a person, as I said earlier, who bird dogs it. By having that person who bird dogs it, in other words, they're responsible for making sure the hazard is known, that the corrective actions or corrective recommendations are talked about and presented to management, the management will get back to us, and that we bring that message back to the safety committee. By having somebody who does that, it's more likely to occur, and then the hazards that we've identified are not left out in space and are for some reason not being fixed. So hazards identified summary, hazard identification summary, the course summary. There is a viable reason for being trained in hazard ID. There's a viable reason for learning and improving our eyes for hazards. There's a viable reason for using a systematic approach. It's all based in hazard elimination and control. But what really makes this viable is the fact that I have learned more to be and help my safety committee be more functional, to do a better job at identifying hazards, to meet the OHSA standard, to make a productive safety committee, but most importantly, by doing all of these things to ensure that our people, our teammates, go home safely every single day. And that's what elimination, hazard elimination and control is all about, is about sending people home safely. So this is why these are all viable and things that you should consider as you continue your walk as a member of the safety committee and work towards improving your eyes and honing your eyes and skills towards hazard identification. So you've got the training, you know why OHSA requires it, you know that the safety committee can be functional if you do this, and you know that you can eliminate hazards and send people home safely. So now it's up to you to go out and start hazard hunting. Thank you.